Hello and welcome to this lecture on microeconomics. Thank you very much for attending. This lecture will continue from the last, just to split the content up, and we'll be ploughing straight in with natural monopoly. Natural monopoly occurs when there are large economies of scale. The minimum efficient scale is an output which is higher than the total demand in the industry. One firm will keep expanding to gain economies of scale. Other firms cannot compete due to cost disadvantages of operating in a smaller scale. If both expanded, the increase in output would lead to a major fall in price. Only one would survive in the long run. Illustrated in front of you, along the average cost curve and the demand curve, showing that the cost implications as you go through expansion are such that the long run average cost due to the economies of scale is downward and outward sloping, and we would expect again where demand reaches the long run average cost curve for a supply issue to occur. Control of natural monopolies. The government can take over natural monopolies to control them. They may introduce marginal cost pricing to achieve allocative efficiency. If the marginal cost is below the average cost, the firm will make a loss equal to below the shaded area, and as a consequence of this, it needs to be subsidised. Alternatively, a firm sets its price where price equals the average cost so it does not make a loss. Another option is that it has to have a fixed fee, for example a monthly rental to cover the loss and set the price equal the marginal cost for allocative efficiency. This is called a two-part tariff. So summing up arguments for monopolies and arguments against monopolies. As we've said previously, a monopolist would produce more than any single firm would in a perfectly competitive market. This can lead to economies of scale and therefore lower costs than in a perfectly competitive market, but it in turn might lead to lower prices and higher output to a perfectly competitive market. Arguments for monopolies. The monopolist produces more than any single firm would in a perfectly competitive market. This may lead to economies of scale and therefore lower costs than would be the case in a perfectly competitive market. This in turn might lead to a lower price and higher output structure than perfect competition. Arguments for monopolies continuing. The abnormal profits may be used to invest in research and development, which may lead to cost-saving innovations. Joseph Schumpeter argued that monopolists are a positive force in the economy. To gain a monopoly position, firms often have to innovate. They gain abnormal profits, which encourage other firms to innovate in areas and gain similar rewards and take away from the first firm's market. This may be true with some markets, but certainly not all monopoly situations. Another advantage or argument for monopoly: competitive markets may overproduce. For example, in the case of a negative externality, by restricting output, the monopolist may actually improve the resource allocation. Arguments against monopolies. Monopolies can earn abnormal profits even in the long term due to barriers of entry. And we've discussed barriers of entry in detail. The monopolist is allocatively inefficient, i.e. the price charged is greater than the marginal cost, and this causes an associated welfare loss. The monopolist may be productively inefficient, may not produce at the minimum of average cost curves. Compared to a perfectly competitive industry with the same cost and demand conditions, a monopolist will charge a higher price for less output. And the last argument against a monopoly is X inefficiency. Because a monopolist dominates a market, they may have less incentive to be efficient and keep costs down. Over time, costs may rise because of inefficiency and complacency. This idea was put forward by Liebenstein. Monopolistic competition on a contestable market. So far we've studied perfect competition, with many producers and no barriers to entry, a monopoly with a single producer in a market with significant barriers to entry. While monopolistic competition is often mistaken for a combination of these two concepts, it's a distinctly separate market form. Monopolistic competition involves many sellers with differentiated products, for example shoe producers or restaurants. In the short run, they can make abnormal profits because they have some control over the market as products are differentiated in some way, for example better location, better design or new technology. In the long run, other firms will be attracted by the abnormal profits demanded for one firm until only normal profits are made. In the long run, the firm is allocatively inefficient because the price of the consumer is willing to pay is greater than the extra cost of production. In short, prices are greater or higher than marginal costs. Productively inefficient because the firm is not producing at the lowest cost per unit, i.e. not at the minimum of the average cost. Illustrations of monopolistic competition are in front of you. In the short run, you'll notice that the average cost is below the demand, and as a consequence of that, where marginal revenues equal marginal costs, the quantity is dictated, the price selected because of the additional revenue generated by the marginal unit, only equaling the marginal cost associated with it. If we carry up the line, you'll see that the average cost is below demand, and as a consequence of that, there is a profit, a short-run profit area. However, in the long run, more firms enter the market and demand for the firm falls. As a consequence of that, You'll notice demand is tangential to the average cost curve. As a consequence of that being at the point where quantity is dictated by marginal revenue meeting marginal cost, prices are dictated at P1, output at Q1, and in the long run, monopolistic competition only makes normal profits. Contestable markets. Most markets in the UK are dominated by a few firms. This is known as oligarchy, the traditional model of oligopoly. It is assumed that there are barriers to entry. In reality, it's likely that firms can enter the market. These are contestable markets. In short, it's possible for the competition to increase within them, but it puts pressure on the existing firms to behave efficiently. According to the theory of contestable markets, if entry to a market is easy, then even though there may be only a few producers, they may act in a competitive manner. The existence of high profits would act as a signal for the others to enter and therefore forces existing firms to be competitive. The assumptions of theory of contestable markets include: there is freedom of entry and exit, so firms can enter and exit the industry at will. The number of firms competing will vary. There will be a monopoly at one time, and then there may be other firms competing at other times, and firms compete rather than collude. According to the theory of contestable markets, abnormal profits earned in the short term attract other firms into the market in the long term, so that only normal profits are earned. A market will be contestable if profits are high, so there is incentive to enter, barriers to entry are low, and barriers to exit are low, so there's relatively easy to join and leave a market with low entry and exit barriers. The industry may suffer from hit and run competition, whereby firms will enter when profits are high and then leave when profits fall. A perfectly contestable market is one in which the costs of entry and exit are zero. In this situation, there is a high degree of firms to act competitively. Abnormal profits will act as an incentive to spur and bring on more firms. Entry is likely to bring in lower prices, better quality of service, more choice, higher output. Markets such as banking have become more contestable, as it becomes easier to enter them due to changes in technology, such as internet banking. Sunk costs are already invested in an industry which cannot be recovered. When considering whether to continue in an industry, a firm should ignore sunk costs. The sunk costs in an industry are high and initial expenditure on specialist equipment is required. This will deter entry into the market and make it less contestable. If sunk costs are low, for example any investment can be easily recovered, the market is likely to be highly contestable. Barriers to entry include sunk costs. If these are low, it's cheap to set up, no specialised equipment, investment, land or IT needed. Marketing costs. How expensive will it be to promote the product and get distribution? Do established product have a strong brand loyalty? Threat and previous action. In a business, if it has to cut prices in the past in response to new entrants, this sends a signal that it is prepared to fight for its market share. This can frighten off new potential entrants. Similarly, if established firms hold excess capacity, this is a signal that they can quickly increase output and drive prices down. Price discrimination. Price discrimination is a key concept in economics. It's the way that most firms make their money. However, there are key features to it which must be understood thoroughly before you try and access price discrimination as a tactic in the marketplace. Price discrimination involves charging different prices for the same good or service which have the same costs of production. For example, old age and student discounts for subsidised domestic transport. To price discriminate, a firm must be able to keep the market separate, prevent individuals from one market buying at a lower price in the other market. It must be able to prevent people from the other market buying at a lower price and reselling at a higher price. Have some control over the price. In short, it must be a price maker. There must be different price elasticity of demand in different markets. These situations are depicted on the illustration in front of you, where the marginal revenue is horizontal, summated and added across. The profit maximising output is found where the marginal cost equals the combined marginal revenues at QA and QB. The marginal revenues must be equal in all markets, and from this the price and quantity can be found in each market. The higher price is charged in the inelastic market, and that is something which you must remember. The highest price always in the inelastic market, the market which responds least to a price decrease, so that the revenue remains high. Methods of price discrimination. There are numerous methods of price discrimination. You can discriminate by status, time, age, branding, and often by geography. Perfect price discrimination. A consumer is charged the maximum he or she is willing to pay for a unit. For each unit, the price is different For every single unit, this removes all consumer surplus. A different price is charged for each unit of revenue. Revenue is ABQ0 origin. Costs are CEQ0 origin, and they can produce and make a profit. Whereas if it charged only one price to all consumers, it could not provide the good or service. Oligopoly.